The scent of burning oak in the grand hearth of the Mercer estate did not smell of warmth or holiday comfort. To Jacqueline, it smelled like an execution. She stood perfectly still in the center of the cavernous, mahogany-paneled study, her spine locked into the rigid posture she had spent 18 years perfecting just to survive the room's atmosphere. On the Persian rug between her combat boots and her stepmother's desk lay the charred, curling remains of heavy parchment paper. The gold-embossed seal of the United States Air Force Academy was currently blackening, bubbling into ash under the relentless lick of the flames. "You are looking at me as if I have robbed you of something, Jacqueline," Eleanor Mercer said, her voice smooth, measured, and entirely devoid of heat. She didn't look up from the financial ledgers laid out before her. Her manicured fingers, adorned with a diamond solitaire that could have bought a fleet of tactical vehicles, turned a page with a crisp, chilling snap. "A mother cannot rob a child of an illusion. I am simply correcting your trajectory." That was a full tuition congressional appointment, Jacqueline said. Her voice didn't shake, but it was dangerously quiet, the low, vibrating hum of a turbine engine before it ignites. "I placed top of the national merit list. I cleared the physical endurance trials with perfect marks. I earned that." Eleanor finally raised her eyes. They were the color of stagnant river water, pale, calculating, and utterly indifferent to the human cost of her ambitions. "You earned a delusion," Eleanor corrected, leaning back into her leather chair. "A Mercer woman does not sweat in digital camouflage. A Mercer woman does not crawl through the mud of Colorado Springs to be yelled at by men who make less in a year than we spend on a charity gala's floral arrangements. You are a girl, Jacqueline. Your utility to this family does not lie in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Your utility lies in your bloodline, your face, and your eventual alignment with a financial house that can secure our northern shipping lanes." She gestured dismissively toward the hallway, where the faint, melodic sound of a Chopin nocturne was being played on a Steinway grand. "Your sister, Cassandra, understands her duty. She is currently preparing her presentation for the Regional Board of Directors. By the time she is 22, she will occupy a permanent seat on the executive committee. That is power. That is legacy. You?" Eleanor let out a short, mocking breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "You are an overhead expense, a bad investment I have spent nearly 2 decades trying to balance. If you think I will allow you to squander our social capital on some pathetic, hyper-masculine rebellion disguised as patriotism, you are sorely mistaken." "It isn't a rebellion," Jacqueline said, her fists clenching so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. "It's my life." "It is whatever I allow it to be," Eleanor whispered, her gaze dropping back to her ledgers, effectively erasing Jacqueline from the room. "The car will be ready at 7 tomorrow morning to take you to the debutante fitting in Boston. Do not be late. It makes you look desperate, and you are already precarious enough." Jacqueline didn't reply. She didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with Eleanor Mercer was like trying to reason with an incoming tide. It simply drowned you faster. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her boots leaving faint prints in the plush, pristine carpet. The storm hit the New England coast at midnight, a howling, violent gale that rattled the heavy sash windows of the estate and turned the Atlantic Ocean into a churning mass of black water and white foam. In the dark of her third-floor bedroom, Jacqueline didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need them. She packed with the methodical, silent efficiency of a thief. Her belongings were few. Eleanor had always strictly controlled her wardrobe, ensuring everything she owned was tailored, restrictive, and designed to display wealth rather than utility. But tucked beneath the floorboards under her bed was her true inheritance. She pulled out a faded, olive-drab canvas rucksack. It was heavy, smelling of old canvas, gun oil, and dried salt. It had belonged to her grandfather, General Arthur Mercer, the only man in the family tree who had chosen the dirt of the front lines over the velvet chairs of the boardroom. He had been dead for 5 years, but before he passed, he had looked at Jacqueline with his piercing, clear blue eyes and told her, "The Mercers build cages out of gold, Jackie. If you stay there long enough, you'll forget your wings were meant for the sky." Inside the bag, she packed 3 sets of heavy cotton undershirts, 2 pairs of rugged denim jeans, a pair of worn-in work boots, and her legal documents, her passport, birth certificate, and social security card which she had stolen back from Eleanor's safe weeks prior in anticipation of this exact night. At the very bottom, she placed her grandfather's silver dog tags. They clinked softly in the darkness, a lonely metallic chime against the roaring of the wind outside. She didn't leave a note. A note gave them something to track, something to analyze for weakness. Jacqueline slipped down the back staircase, avoiding the security cameras she had spent months cataloging. When she pushed open the heavy iron kitchen door and stepped into the storm, the rain hit her like a physical blow. It was freezing, sharp as needles, stripping away the suffocating warmth of the Mercer mansion within seconds. She walked down the long, winding driveway, her canvas pack heavy on her shoulders, never once looking back at the house where she had been treated as nothing more than a depreciating asset. As the iron gates clicked shut behind her, she felt a terrifying, exhilarating void open up in her chest. She had no money, no family support, and no safety net. She was 18 years old, completely alone and finally free. The transition from the sterile luxury of the Mercer estate to the brutal, unyielding reality of Air Force basic military training at Lackland was a baptism by fire. If Eleanor Mercer had spent 18 years trying to break Jacqueline's spirit through psychological isolation, the military tried to break her body through sheer, unadulterated friction. The humidity of the Texas summer was an oppressive weight, a thick, wet blanket that smelled of diesel exhaust, scorched tarmac, and the collective sweat of 60 terrified recruits. "Move, element, move," a voice roared in her ear, spray flying from the instructor's mouth as he stood less than 2 inches from her face. "You are too slow, Mercer. Is your daddy rich? Did your mommy hold your hand? Because out here, you are absolutely nothing but a liability to the United States Air Force." Jacqueline didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked on a distant, imaginary point on the wall behind the instructor. Rain, sweat, and tears from the tear gas chamber had long since blurred her vision, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. Every time her muscles screamed during the endless cycles of push-ups on the blistering asphalt, every time her lungs felt like they were filling with liquid glass during the tactical combat casualty drills, she thought of the fireplace. She thought of the gold seal turning into ash. She didn't just survive the training, she consumed it. While the other recruits wept in their bunks at night, nursing shin splints and blisters, Jacqueline sat cross-legged in the dark, mentally reviewing emergency checklists for the UH-60 Black Hawk. She memorized the aerodynamic properties of rotary wing aircraft until the formulas felt like poetry. She pushed herself past the point of physical exhaustion during the selection phases for the elite combat search and rescue CSAR units, a pipeline that traditionally chewed up and spat out 90% of its applicants, almost all of them men. They called her the Ghost and her squadron. She didn't join the others for weekend drinks when they finally got base liberty. She didn't call home. She didn't have a home. Her home was the flight line, the smell of burnt JP-8 fuel, and the cold mechanical symmetry of a helicopter instrument panel. By the time she earned her wings and her commission, her hands were no longer soft. They were calloused, scarred from slipping wrenches and sharp aluminum rivets. Her skin was tanned dark by the sun of various training ranges, and her eyes had lost the vulnerable look of a trapped, wealthy girl. They were the eyes of a predator that had learned to love the storm. October 24, 2024. The Hindu Kush mountain range, Afghanistan, altitude 11,500 feet. The cockpit of the HH-60G Pavehawk was an inferno of warning lights and auditory alarms. "Master caution! Master caution!" The automated voice chimed in Jacqueline's headset, its calm, synthetic cadence completely detached from the violence of the reality outside. "Shut up, Betty, I know," Jacqueline growled through her oxygen mask, her knuckles white as she fought the collective and cyclic sticks. The night was pitch black, illuminated only by the ghostly green glow of her night vision goggles NVGs, and the erratic, terrifying arcs of tracer fire rising from the jagged, snow-capped peaks below. They were flying deep within a canyon so narrow that a 5-degree mistake in her banking angle would slap the main rotor blades right into the granite walls. A 3-man tactical intelligence team codenamed Anvil, 7 had been compromised on a ridgeline. They were out of ammunition, surrounded by an overwhelming insurgent force, and a severe alpine blizzard was closing in, cutting off all standard air support. Every other asset had turned back due to zero visibility conditions. Jacqueline hadn't turned back. Captain, tail rotor efficiency is down 40%. Her co-pilot, a young lieutenant named Miller, shouted over the roar of the twin General Electric turbines. We took a heavy hit through the aft pylon on that last pass. The airframe is vibrating past structural limits. We need to abort and punch out. Abort is not an option, Miller. Jacqueline shot back, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. Anvil 7 has 20 seconds before they're overrun. Look down. That's our boys. Through the infrared sensor on her nose mount, she could see them. 3 heat signatures huddled against a sheer rock wall, their muzzle flashes growing sporadic as they fired their final magazines. Surrounding them were dozens of fast-moving, hostile thermal shapes closing the distance. Setting up for a one-wheel hover, Jacqueline commanded, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, rhythmic state. This was the peak of the blackout, a state where the external world ceased to exist, and her mind fused completely with the machine. She swung the massive 20,000-pound helicopter around, using the howling mountain headwind to catch the failing tail rotor. The wind tore at the aircraft, trying to fling it against the mountain like a toy, but Jacqueline's inputs on the controls were microscopic, aggressive, and perfectly timed. Thump, thump, thump. The rear right wheel of the landing gear touched the edge of the jagged, snowy cliff face. The rest of the helicopter hung over an absolute 3,000-foot drop. Go, get them in! She yelled into the intercom to her paraskew jumpers, PJs, in the back. The cabin door slid open, and the freezing mountain air rushed in, bringing with it the deafening sound of gunfire and the smell of cordite. Through her side window, Jacqueline watched the PJs drag the 3 bloodied, exhausted intelligence operators through the door. Just as the last man cleared the threshold, a rocket-propelled grenade, RPG, detonated against the ridgeline directly beneath them. The shockwave slammed into the belly of the Pavehawk. The tail rotor gearbox screamed its final dying note as the remaining oil drained out into the freezing sky. The helicopter immediately broke into a violent, uncontrolled clockwise spin, dropping like a stone into the Black Canyon. We lost the tail. We're spinning. We're going down. Miller screamed, his hands freezing on the controls. I have the aircraft, Jacqueline shouted, violently pushing his hands away. In a spinning helicopter near a mountain wall, standard procedure was useless. She didn't try to stop the spin with the pedals. There was no tail rotor to respond. Instead, she pushed the cyclic forward, diving the nose straight down into the abyss, using gravity to trade altitude for airspeed. The canyon walls rushed past her NVGs in a blur of deadly rock. Come on, you beautiful bastard, fly, she whispered to the airframe. As the airspeed crossed 90 knots, the aerodynamic force against the vertical stabilizer began to act like a makeshift rudder, naturally streamlining the nose and halting the spin. She pulled back on the collective just 20 feet above the canyon floor, the belly of the helicopter skimming the snowbank so close that it left a massive gouged trench in the white drifts. The turbines roared, complaining bitterly, but the Pavehawk held. She nursed the crippled, rattling machine through the exit corridors of the mountains, flying beneath the radar threshold. Her hands steady even as her uniform shirt was entirely soaked through with sweat. They crossed back into safe airspace just as the sun began to rise over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in ribbons of blood orange and pale gold. 3 weeks later, in a windowless, soundproofed briefing room at Langley, Virginia, a 4-star general pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross with a V device for valor onto Jacqueline's uniform. Your actions saved the lives of 3 deeply embedded operatives whose intelligence preserves our strategic advantage in the region for the next decade, Captain, the general said, his expression solemn. But because of the nature of the operation, this mission does not exist. Your flight logs have been scrubbed. The maintenance reports on your airframe have been classified under a black budget wrapper. The public will never know your name. Your peers will only know you took a bird out for a routine repositioning and brought it back damaged. The general looked her in the eyes, searching for resentment. Does that bother you, Captain Mercer? Jacqueline looked down at the small, heavy metal in its velvet case. She thought of Eleanor. She thought of the Mercer legacy built on public relations, newspaper clippings, and curated appearances. No, sir, Jacqueline said, her voice steady and proud. The people who matter know I was there. The sky knows I was there. That's more than enough. The contrast between her real life and her family's perception of it reached a point of dark comedy during her mandatory post-deployment leave in 2026. She'd been ordered by the military to take 2 weeks of downtime after an intense operational cycle. With nowhere else to go and wanting to see if there was any shred of humanity left in her father, she traveled back to New England. She wore her service dress uniform, clean and pressed, the silver pilot wings gleaming proudly above her ribbons. She arrived at the Mercer estate during a high-profile dinner party celebrating Cassandra's appointment as the youngest chief operating officer in the firm's history. The driveway was packed with Maybachs, Bentleys, and Teslas. When Jacqueline walked through the front doors, the butler, a man who had known her since childhood, looked at her uniform with a mixture of surprise and profound discomfort. "Miss Jacqueline," he whispered. "Your mother." "Mrs. Mercer is in the formal dining room." Jacqueline walked into the dining room, her boots making a distinct, heavy thud, thud, thud on the hardwood floor that cut cleanly through the polite laughter and the clinking of crystal wine glasses. The room went completely silent. 30 pairs of wealthy, influential eyes turned to look at the woman in the military uniform. Eleanor Mercer sat at the head of the long table looking resplendent in emerald silk. Her eyes narrowed as they swept over Jacqueline's uniform, lingering for a fraction of a second on the silver wings before turning into hard, cold stones. "Jacqueline," Eleanor said, her voice carrying beautifully across the quiet room, pitched perfectly so every guest could hear. "What a surprising arrival. I see you are still playing your little games with the government." A few of the older men at the table smiled indulgently, as if looking at a child who had dressed up for Halloween. "I am on leave, Eleanor," Jacqueline said smoothly, refusing to use the word mother. "Of course you are," Eleanor said, turning back to the billionaire real estate developer sitting to her right. "You must forgive my stepdaughter, Richard. She left us years ago to pursue a rather administrative position down in Washington. I believe she is currently a logistics supervisor for parts inventory at a naval depot or something of the sort. Someone has to keep track of the screwdrivers, I suppose." A soft, polite ripple of laughter went around the table. Jacqueline looked at her father, Charles Mercer, who sat halfway down the table. He looked away, focusing intently on cutting his filet mignon, completely unwilling to challenge his wife's narrative. She then looked at Cassandra, who sat across from him. Her sister looked stunning, her skin flawless, wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than Jacqueline's annual military salary. Cassandra met her gaze with a smirk that was a perfect, genetic copy of Eleanor's, a look of supreme, unearned superiority. "It must be exhausting work, dear," Eleanor continued, her tone dripping with mock pity. "All that dust and inventory. If you ever tire of lifting boxes in Washington, the offer for a position in our archival department is still open. We can always use someone who knows how to categorize old folders." Jacqueline felt the weight of the distinguished flying cross tucked safely inside her uniform's inner pocket, right against her heart. She looked at the 30 people in the room surrounded by gold leaf fine china and centuries of inherited wealth, all of them entirely blind to the fact that the very freedom they used to sit here and mock her had been paid for in blood by people they would never deem worthy of their presence. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of anger, it was a smile of absolute detachment. They couldn't touch her anymore. Their words were just low-frequency noise, easily drowned out by the memory of a twin-turbine engine roaring at 11,000 feet. "Thank you for the offer, Eleanor," Jacqueline said, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of the shame her stepmother so desperately wanted her to feel. "But I find I prefer working with things that actually have a purpose." She turned around and walked out of the room, leaving the complacent silence of the Mercer estate behind her forever, her eyes already looking upward toward the next storm. The air conditioning inside the VIP Horizon suite on the top floor of Atlanta's Metropolitan Plaza didn't just cool the room, it pressurized it. Suspended 80 floors above the humid Georgia afternoon, the glass-walled conference chamber felt entirely detached from the earth, looking down upon the sprawl of the city like an observation deck on a private satellite. It was an environment designed explicitly to make individuals feel small, exposed, and mathematically insignificant. Jacqueline Mercer stepped through the double mahogany doors, her entrance marked by a heavy, deliberate cadence that immediately shattered the room's artificial quiet. She wore her Air Force service dress uniform, the deep, midnight blue wool pristine and heavily structured. Across her left breast, the rows of ribbons formed a dense, colorful mosaic of silver, gold, and deep blue, crowned by the polished silver wings of a command pilot. It was a uniform that demanded a specific, reverent silence in any federal building in the world. But below the crisp hem of her pressed trousers, she had refused the standard high-gloss low quarters. Instead, she wore her operational tactical boots. They were scarred, scuffed, and deeply embedded with the coarse grayish-white salt crust of her last deployment. Every step she took across the plush, cream-colored wool rug left a faint, ghostly outline of dried brina, deliberate, unyielding intrusion of the mud and blood of the real world into a sanctuary of sterile billions. At the far end of the immense court's conference table sat the triumvirate of her biological history. Eleanor Mercer sat dead center, racked in a pale cream Chanel suit that mirrored the room's color palette perfectly, rendering her almost invisible to the glass background, except for her eyes, which remained as sharp and dark as obsidian shards. To her right sat Cassandra, balancing a crystal flute of vintage Krug champagne between two fingers. Her posture fluid, relaxed, and radiates the supreme confidence of someone who owned the air everyone else was breathing. To Eleanor's left sat Arthur Mercer. He looked older than he had during her brief holiday visit. His silver hair slicked back tightly, his face set into a mask of patriarchal exhaustion that he had long used to disguise his profound moral cowardice. And flanking them like a guard dog in a three-piece charcoal Savile Row suit was Marcus Vance. He was the family's chief legal architect, a man whose reputation for dismantling human lives in corporate litigation was legendary in the elite circles of the Eastern Seaboard. He didn't look up when Jacqueline entered. He merely clicked the top of a custom Mont Blanc pen, the sound sharp as a firing pin. "Sit, Jacqueline," Eleanor said, not gesturing to a chair but rather indicating a small, isolated leather seat on the opposite side of the court's expanse, directly beneath the glare of the recessed LED lighting. "We have precisely 45 minutes before Marcus has to catch a private transport to New York. Let us not waste time with military posture." Jacqueline didn't take the seat. She remained standing, her feet spaced precisely shoulder-width apart, her hands clasped loosely behind her back in a modified parade rest. Her gaze didn't rest on her mother or her sister. It fixed on the center of the table, tracking a slight wobble in the crystal vase holding imported white orchids. "You are summoned here to resolve an outstanding liability, Captain," Marcus Vance began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone cultivated in federal courtrooms. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the white quartz. It stopped exactly 3 inches from the edge of Jacqueline's side. "For the past 15 years, the Mercer Family Trust has carried your development, your private schooling prior to your abrupt departure, your health care, and your logistical upkeep as a non-performing asset. In short, you have been an expensive luxury the estate could ill afford while managing national-level infrastructure investments." "An invoice," Jacqueline said, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. "You brought me to Atlanta to hand me an invoice." Cassandra let out a soft, melodic laugh, the champagne in her glass swirling lazily. "Let's call it a reality check, Jackie. You've been hiding out in Washington for years, pulling a bloated government security stipend, playing soldier while the rest of us actually sweat over the family's industrial portfolio. Do you have any idea what federal interest rates did to our shipping logistics sector this quarter? No, of course you don't. You're too busy counting screwdrivers and checking fluid levels in some subterranean warehouse. She leaned forward, setting the glass down with a precise metallic clink against the stone table. The family needs liquid collateral to secure the new federal defense logistics contract for the Atlantic seaboard. The Newport estate, the one grandfather left explicitly to you, in that ridiculous, senile codicil, is currently sitting empty. It's an unproductive piece of rock. We need you to sign the quitclaim deed and the title transfer over to Mercer Holdings immediately. Consider it your retroactive buy-in for 15 years of unearned privilege. Grandfather's house is not an asset of Mercer Holdings, Jacqueline stated calmly. It was deeded to me through his personal estate after his retirement from the Joint Chiefs. It has nothing to do with your corporate debt. Arthur Mercer slammed his palm onto the table, the massive ice bucket holding the champagne rattling violently. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson. It has everything to do with this family, Jacqueline, he roared, his voice echoing off the reinforced glass walls. Do not take that tone with us. You stand there covered in ribbons you probably earned for filling out supply manifests in triplicate, looking down your nose at the people who gave you your very name. Your sister is operating at the highest levels of federal capital allocation. She is talking to senators, to undersecretaries of defense. And you? You are a glorified parts clerk who refuses to throw her grain of salt into the family storehouse when the winter comes. Jacqueline didn't answer immediately. Inside her chest, the familiar old heat tried to rise, the hot, stinging anger of the little girl who had watched her dreams get thrown into a fireplace. But she didn't let it touch her throat. Instead, she initiated her tactical breathing cycle, a habit forged in the high G turns of advanced flight training and perfected in the darkness of the Hindu Kush. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. With each completion of the box, she felt her pulse settle, locking flat at exactly 60 beats per minute. Her heart rate monitor, ticking silently beneath her heavy wool jacket, would have shown a perfectly horizontal line. Her mind became a cold, high-resolution sensor array. She looked at her father and didn't see a parent. She saw an unstable airframe vibrating toward a structural failure. You seem very certain about the nature of my assignment in Washington, Cassandra, Jacqueline said, her eyes moving to her sister. Please, Jacqueline, Cassandra scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. We have eyes inside the Department of Defense. We know your pay grade. We know your billet is listed under Base Support and Supply Logistics, District of Columbia. You're a paper pusher with silver wings. It's pathetic, really. You ran away to be a hero, and you ended up an administrative drone. Just sign the papers. If you don't, Marcus has already prepared the filing. Vance smiled, a thin, bloodless line. Let's be entirely transparent, Captain. If you refuse to cooperate with the family's restructuring, we will be forced to release certain background narratives to the military press. We have documented evidence of your erratic departure at 18, your total estrangement from your biological parents, and certain psychological profiles from your initial screening that can easily be interpreted as highly unstable. A few targeted leaks to the Air Force Times, a formal inquiry sent to the Armed Services Committee regarding your security clearance validity. It would make your quiet little supply job in Washington very uncomfortable. You'd be looking at a dishonorable discharge or a forced early retirement before the month is out. You would defame your own daughter's military record to secure a shipping line? Jacqueline asked Arthur directly. Arthur looked down, his jaw tight, his fingers tracing the rim of his crystal glass. You gave up the right to be protected by this family the night you walked out into that storm, Jacqueline. If you won't be an asset, you are an enemy. And we liquidate liabilities. I see, Jacqueline said. She reached into her small, leather military briefcase, pulled out a sleek, unbranded black tablet and laid it gently onto the quartz table. She didn't turn it toward them. She kept it flat under her palm. What is that? Eleanor asked, her first utterance in 10 minutes, her voice dropping an octave into true suspicion. "Marcus, what is she doing?" "Captain Mercer, this mediation is strictly confidential," Vance warned, leaning forward. "No recording devices are permitted in this suite." "This isn't a recording device, Mr. Vance," Jacqueline said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet turbine-hum cadence. "This is a terminal. And you are correct about one thing. My billet in Washington is listed under Base Support and Supply Logistics. That is the administrative wrapper for the 427th Special Operations Squadron, operating out of a restricted hangar at Pope Field and managed via a Department of Defense black budget repository." She lifted her hand from the screen. The tablet flickered to life, displaying a massive glowing red seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency, overlaid with a single word in bold white text, "Sapphire Eye, no foreign." 5 minutes before I walked into this plaza, Jacqueline continued, her eyes locked onto Vance's suddenly freezing face. A automated security sweep flagged a high-volume data query originating from an IP address registered to Vance and Associates. "Someone in your office, Marcus, tried to access my flight logs from October 2024 using an outdated congressional clearance token your firm retained from an old maritime transport lobby." The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the tower's ventilation system sounded like a jet engine. "That operation, the one you just tried to scrape for blackmail material, is a Tier 1 national security asset," Jacqueline said, her voice dropping like an anvil. "The names of the men I pulled out of that canyon are currently operating under deep-cover diplomatic aliases in Eastern Europe. By attempting to pull those files to threaten an active duty officer, your firm has just tripped a counterintelligence tripwire established by the National Security Agency." Vance's face went completely white. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked at his Mont Blanc pen as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. That was a standard background verification, a routine check for litigation preparation. It was an unauthorized intrusion into a special access program, Jacqueline interrupted, her voice cutting his words off like a steel blade. "As we speak, 2 field agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations are entering the ground floor of your firm's main office on Peachtree Street. They are serving a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of all servers, hard drives, and personal communication devices belonging to you and any associate linked to the Mercer account." "Arthur!" Eleanor snapped, her voice losing its smooth veneer for the first time in her life, a sharp, ugly note of panic breaking through. "Make her stop this. She is bluffing. She is a girl from our house. She doesn't have this kind of leverage." Arthur didn't move. He looked at Jacqueline's boots, at the salt stains on the carpet, and for the first time in 18 years he realized exactly what kind of monster they had accidentally created by trying to starve her. "I am not from your house, Eleanor," Jacqueline said, leaning over the table, her hands flat on the quartz, her face inches from her stepmother's. "Your house is a cage made of paper money and fake smiles. My house is the sky. And out there, we don't negotiate with parasites who try to trade blood for shipping lanes." She picked up her tablet, slipped it back into her briefcase, and adjusted the alignment of her service cap. "Keep the Newport estate papers, Cassandra," Jacqueline whispered, her eyes burning into her sister's trembling gaze. "You're going to need the equity to pay Marcus's defense fees. The United States government is about to audit Mercer Holdings from the top down to see exactly how many other federal clearance tokens your firm has been abusing." She turned on her scuffed, salt-crusted boots, the sound of her exit loud and rhythmic against the silence of the Horizon suite. As the mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, she didn't look back at the glass tower. She looked straight ahead, toward the elevators, her heart rate still locked perfectly at 60. The federal courtroom in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia did not feature the polished mahogany or plush carpeting of the Horizon suite. It was a room built from cold institutional granite and heavy oak, designed to smell of old paper, ozone, and the absolute authority of the federal government. Above the judge's bench, the great bronze seal of the United States loomed like an unblinking eye, casting a long shadow over the proceedings below. Senior District Judge Arthur Lawson, a legendary figure in federal procurement law and a designated jurist for the Defense Logistics Agency's Oversight Committee, sat motionless behind his elevated bench. His face was a map of weathered stone, carved by 40 years of navigating the complex, often corrupt intersections of corporate greed and military contracting. Before him on the bench lay a thick, heavily secured document courier pouch. It was bound in heavy waterproof canvas, secured with a tamper-evident titanium locking bar, and stenciled with a stark red ink designation, Mark 10 Special ACCES, Perpetri Procut, Procurement Overwatcher. Inside was a single, high-density secure flash drive containing a heavily encrypted file labeled simply as Mercer Decree Fidel Danelcy Bull. Below the bench, the physical division of the courtroom spoke volumes. On the left side sat the Mercer family. Eleanor Mercer looked as though she had been chiseled from marble, her jaw set so tightly the muscles in her throat vibrated. Beside her, Cassandra was frantically tapping on an encrypted satellite phone, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as her screen flashed a succession of red network error codes. Marcus Vance sat next to them, his sharp, predatory posture entirely gone. His expensive suit now looked too big for him, his collar damp with a cold sweat that had been dry since the Office of Special Investigations raided his office 3 hours prior. On the right side of the aisle stood Jacqueline. She had not removed her service cap. She stood at the center podium, her posture a perfect vertical axis, her scuffed, salt-crusted combat boots anchored to the linoleum floor. She looked entirely apart from the panic radiating from her family, her expression as calm and unreadable as the sky before a midnight freeze. "Mr. Vance," Judge Lawson began, his voice a low, rumbling bass that vibrated the heavy oak railings of the courtroom. "Your firm filed an emergency petition to halt a federal asset freeze and to compel the immediate administrative transfer of real property from a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. You cited family governance, corporate default vulnerability, and a purported breach of fiduciary duty by Captain Jacqueline Mercer. Is that correct?" Vance stood up, his voice cracking slightly before he caught his footing. "Yes, Your Honor. The family's defense aerospace sector, Mercer Aerospace Systems, faces an imminent liquidity crisis that threatens a major federal drone supply chain. The property in Newport is family land, wrongfully withheld by the defendant. Her refusal to sign the transfer protocol constitutes a direct, malicious sabotage of an essential national security contractor." Judge Lawson didn't look at Vance. He picked up a heavy black digital stylus and touched the screen of his terminal, entering a 90-character cryptographic key that had been transmitted to him directly from the Pentagon via a secure courier. On the massive 60-foot digital display wall behind the witness stand, the contents of Mercer Decree Fidel. Doc X began to decrypt. The screen flickered, transitioning from a black terminal screen to a brilliant, terrifying layout of digital watermarks, active network stencils, and at the bottom of the document, an active, pulsing, gold cryptographic signature. The indifference on Judge Lawson's face vanished instantly. The seasoned jurist froze, his eyes widening as they scanned the electronic stencils. He leaned forward so abruptly that his heavy gavel rolled off its block, clattering loudly against the oak bench. His breath caught audibly in his microphone, a sharp, ragged gasp that made the court reporter look up in shock. He wasn't looking at a standard corporate contract. He was looking at a document that possessed a classification level so high it technically bypassed the standard Department of Justice oversight entirely. The signature at the bottom of the digital manifest did not read Captain Jacqueline Mercer. It read, Colonel J. Mercer, Commanding Officer, 427th Air Mobile AP, Sapiter I Protocol Detachage. Judge Lawson slowly took off his reading glasses, his hand shaking with an emotion that had nothing to do with corporate law. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes passing completely over Eleanor, over the trembling Cassandra, and locked directly onto Jacqueline. The silence in the courtroom grew so thick it felt suffocating. Slowly, deliberately, the 72-year-old federal judge stood up from his leather chair. He did not look at his notes. He walked around the high bench. descending the steps to the courtroom floor, an unprecedented breach of judicial protocol that caused Marcus Vance to take a step back in sheer bewilderment. Judge Lawson stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Jacqueline's podium. He drew his shoulders back, brought his feet together until his heels clicked, and raised his right hand to his brow, executing a textbook, trembling, and deeply reverent military salute. "The court recognizes the presence of the commander," Judge Lawson said, his voice thick with a raw, breaking emotion that stunned every civilian in the room into absolute silence. "Colonel Mercer, on October 24, 2024, a team from the 3rd Ranger Battalion was isolated on a ridgeline in the Hindu Kush. The intelligence team leader who was pulled from that burning canyon floor with 2 broken legs and a shattered spine. That was Captain Thomas Lawson, my only son." A low, collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Lawson's hand remained at his brow, his eyes shining with tears he didn't care to wipe away. "For 2 years, my family has looked at a blank space in the National Archive, unable to find the pilot who flew through a wall of fire when every other airframe turned back. They told me the file was a ghost. They told me the pilot didn't exist." He slowly lowered his salute, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "The world may not know what you did, Colonel, but this court knows, and my family will never forget." Eleanor Mercer's breath hissed through her teeth, as if she had been struck with a whip. She bolted upright from her chair, her face contorting into an ugly, desperate mask. "Your Honor, this is a conflict of interest." "This woman is an imposter. She is a logistics captain, a runaway who was cast out of my home for instability. She has forged those credentials." "Sit down, Mrs. Mercer." Judge Lawson roared, turning on her with a fury that made the courtroom marshals instantly step toward the plaintiff's table, their hands resting flat against their sidearms. "One more word from you without my permission, and I will have you held in federal custody for contempt before you can take another breath." He turned back to Jacqueline, his expression softening into profound respect. "Colonel Mercer, your counsel has the floor." Jacqueline nodded once, a microscopic tilt of her service cap. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense activates the public disclosure protocol under the Federal Procurement Fraud Act." Beside Jacqueline, her military defense counsel, a sharp-eyed captain from the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps, stepped to the podium and struck a key on his terminal. The digital display wall behind him shifted instantly, the document closing to reveal a dual-layered financial ledger that stretched back 6 years. "Let the record show," the JAG attorney announced, his voice echoing with cold forensic precision, "that while Mercer Holdings and Eleanor Mercer have spent the last decade characterizing Colonel Mercer as an unproductive asset and an overhead expense, the reality is mathematically reversed. We have extracted the true, unredacted transaction history from the encrypted accounts linked to the Mercer Family Trust." The screen zoomed in on a line item dated November 14, 2020. "In 2020, the attorney read, Mrs. Eleanor Mercer faced a confidential federal tax lien on the primary estate in Massachusetts for unpaid luxury asset revenues totaling $50,000. Failure to settle would have resulted in a public asset seizure during a critical shareholder meeting. This debt was settled in full via an anonymous wire transfer originating from a military banking facility in Stuttgart, Germany. That money was drawn directly from the combat hazard and imminent danger pay accumulated by then-Lieutenant Jacqueline Mercer during her deployment with the Seawolf Rotary Detachment." Eleanor stared at the screen, her lips turning the color of ash. Her fingers clutched her Chanel purse so hard the leather groaned. "Moving forward to July 2023, the attorney continued, his voice relentless as he scrolled down the ledger. Miss Cassandra Mercer was named as a primary target in a corporate fraud investigation by the state of Ohio regarding the illegal diversion of state commercial grants. To prevent a public indictment that would have shattered the family's credit rating, a bond of $85,000 was deposited with the state treasury. That bond was secured using the military honored trust account belonging to Colonel Mercer, funds she had set aside to fund the medical care of retired veterans from her grandfather's old command." "That's a lie!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice cracking as she jumped to her feet. her glass of champagne slipping from her fingers and shattering against the granite floor, the expensive liquid pooling around her designer heels. "She didn't save me. She's a thief. She stole those files." "The electronic signatures do not lie, Miss Mercer," Judge Lawson said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. "They are verified by the Federal Reserve's blockchain network. Every dollar you used to maintain your luxury lifestyle while calling your sister a parasite was paid for with the blood money she earned in regions you wouldn't survive for 10 minutes. But that is not the reason we are here today," Jacqueline spoke, her voice finally breaking her silence, cutting through Cassandra's hysterics like a sonic boom. She stepped closer to the display screen, her fingers tracking the data fields of the docs file that remained active at the core of the system. "3 months ago," Jacqueline said, looking directly into Eleanor's panicked eyes, "Mercer Aerospace Systems submitted a bid for the Mark 10 federal drone supply contract. To meet the material criteria, Cassandra Mercer authorized the procurement of a specific titanium aluminum composite for the drone's structural wings. You claimed this alloy was sourced from certified domestic foundries. You attempted to use my grandfather's Newport estate as equity to clear the final financial vetting for that bid." She tapped the screen. The document unfolded further, revealing a series of high-resolution metallurgic scans and customs manifests, watermarked by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS. "The material you actually bought," Jacqueline whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying weight, "was a substandard porous composite smuggled through a shell corporation in the South China Sea. It is an alloy that undergoes catastrophic structural delamination when exposed to temperatures below -20 degrees, the exact operational envelope of our high-altitude reconnaissance drones. You didn't just commit procurement fraud, Cassandra. You introduced a structural failure into the frontline aviation assets of the United States military to save $4 million on your quarterly balance sheet." No, that was a supplier error," Vance stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to pack his documents into his briefcase. "We have a cure period. We can replace the material." "There is no cure period for treason, Mr. Vance," Jacqueline said coldly. "As the superior officer commanding the Regional Procurement Overwatch Detachment under the Sapphire Eye Protocol, I have already executed the final administrative order contained within this secured docs manifest." She pointed to the flashing gold seal on the screen. "Effective at 0800 hours this morning, Mercer Aerospace Systems has been permanently flagged on the Federal Excluded Parties List system. Your facility in Savannah is currently being cordoned off by federal agents. Your corporate digital infrastructure has been locked down under an emergency national security freeze. The bidding rights for the Atlantic Seaboard contract are officially revoked, and all assets belonging to Mercer Holdings, including the funds you used to lease that suite in the Metropolitan Plaza, have been placed into a federal receivership pending a grand jury indictment for defense sabotage." The courtroom doors behind them burst open with a loud, violent slam. 6 federal marshals, accompanied by agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service wearing black tactical vests, poured into the room. They didn't hesitate. They bypassed the defense table entirely and swarmed the plaintiff's side of the aisle. "Cassandra Mercer, Eleanor Mercer, Marcus Vance," the lead agent announced, pulling 3 sets of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal procurement fraud, wire fraud, and violation of the National Defense Authorization Act. Hands behind your back, now." Cassandra began to scream, a high, piercing wail of pure terror as an agent grabbed her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back and clicking the steel cuff tightly over her manicured skin. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. "Dad, do something! Tell them who we are! Tell them!" Arthur Mercer didn't move. He sat frozen in his chair, his face completely pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the gold wings on Jacqueline's chest. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time, he saw the terrifying, unyielding power of the weapon they had spent 18 years trying to discard. He didn't say a word as the agents pulled his wife and his youngest daughter out of their chairs, dragging them down the center aisle of the courtroom. Eleanor stopped as she reached Jacqueline's podium. Her hair was disheveled, her cream suit wrinkled by the agent's grip. but her eyes still burned with a toxic, dying hatred. "You ruined us," Eleanor hissed, her breath hot and sour against the cold air of the courtroom. "You are a monster, Jacqueline. You destroyed your own family." Jacqueline looked at her stepmother, her pulse remaining locked at 60 beats per minute, her expression entirely serene as the shadows of the courtroom seal fell across her face. "A family builds things that last, Eleanor," Jacqueline said softly, her voice echoing into the empty space left by their departure. "You just built a cage. I simply turned the key." She turned toward the bench, gave Judge Lawson a final, crisp salute, and walked out of the courtroom, her scuffed, salt-crusted boots leaving one final, permanent set of tracks on the institutional floor as the doors swung shut behind her. The legal defense table of Vance and Associates did not collapse with a roar. It fell apart with the frantic metallic slide of a zipper. Marcus Vance had spent 30 years cultivating the posture of an untouchable legal deity along the eastern seaboard. But as the golden cryptographic seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency pulsed on the courtroom's 60-foot digital display, that posture dissolved into pure animal survival instinct. He wasn't looking at a bitter family dispute over real estate anymore. He was looking at a Tier 1 counterintelligence operation. He was looking at a direct line to a federal penitentiary for treasonous collusion, obstruction of justice, and the unauthorized scraping of classified special access programs. Without uttering a single word to Eleanor or Arthur, Vance's hands flew across the white quartz table. He jammed a stack of unfiled motions into his custom leather briefcase, the papers crinkling violently under his trembling fingers. His expensive Mont Blanc pen, the one he had clicked so arrogantly just 20 minutes prior, was dropped carelessly into his pocket, its cap left rolling against the stone table. Marcus, what are you doing?" Eleanor's voice lost its calculated, aristocratic resonance, rising into a sharp, thin pitch. She reached out, her manicured hand clawing at the sleeve of his charcoal Savile Row jacket. "The cross-examination. You haven't even challenged her credentials yet, Marcus." Vance violently ripped his arm from her grip, not even looking her in the eye. "This mediation is over, Eleanor," he hissed, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask as he snapped the heavy brass locks of his briefcase shut. "Your daughter isn't a parts clerk. She's an active-duty commander under a black-budget DIA wrapper. Do you have any idea what you've done? You brought me into a counter-espionage tripwire. I am withdrawing as counsel effective immediately." He didn't wait for a response. Turning on his heel, the high-priced fixer of the Mercer empire practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom. He pushed through the swinging oak doors so hard they rattled against their brass hinges, abandoning the multi-billion-dollar dynasty to the cold, unyielding mechanics of federal justice without a single backward glance. The vacuum left by Vance's flight was instantly filled by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots. 4 heavily armored agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, moved into the courtroom, their black tactical vests emblazoned with bold white federal lettering that caught the harsh glare of the LED lights. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized economy of a military assault team, cutting off every exit row behind the plaintiff's table. "Cassandra Mercer," the lead agent announced, his voice flat, mechanical, and entirely devoid of human pity. He drew a pair of blackened steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, the links metallic and sharp in the quiet room. "You are under arrest for first-degree federal procurement fraud, corporate espionage, and intentional sabotage of national defense equipment under Title 18 of the United States Code." No, get away from me," Cassandra shrieked. The fluid, casual arrogance she had displayed while sipping champagne in the Horizon Suite vanished entirely. As an agent stepped forward and grabbed her wrist, she panicked, her designer heels slipping on the polished linoleum floor. She fell hard, her knees striking the base of the witness stand with a dull thunk, her ivory silk trousers instantly staining with the spilled, shattered remains of her vintage Krug. The steel cuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a heavy, final clack. The coldness of the metal against her skin seemed to shock her system, reducing her from a ruthless chief operating officer to a terrified, weeping child huddled on the courtroom floor. "Mom, Dad, stop them. They can't touch me. I run the capital allocation. I run the network." Beside her, Eleanor and Arthur Mercer stood completely frozen, turned to stone by the sheer incomprehensible scale of their ruin. Arthur's face was the color of old parchment, his jaw hanging slack as he stared at the rows of ribbons on Jacqueline's chest. The daughter he had dismissed as an overhead expense, the girl he had tried to emotionally starve into submission, was currently standing before him as the hand of the state itself, holding the absolute power of life-death and financial erasure over everything he had spent his life building. Eleanor's facade did not just crack, it shattered into an ugly, desperate display of human terror. Dropping her designer purse onto the stained floor, the matriarch of the Mercer family sank to her knees. She crawled forward 2 steps, her expensive Chanel suit dragging through the spilled champagne, until she was clutching at the heavy salt-crusted leather of Jacqueline's combat boots. "Jacqueline. Jackie, please," Eleanor sobbed, her tears tracking paths through her heavy, expensive makeup. She looked up, her face twisted into a pathetic plea. "She's your sister. She's just a girl. She didn't know what she was buying. Use your clearance. Call them off. You have the DIA tokens. You can freeze the indictment, please, for the sake of the Mercer name. For your father." Jacqueline looked down at her stepmother. Her blue eyes were entirely flat, reflecting the fluorescent lights like the surface of a frozen Atlantic bay. Her pulse remained perfectly, chillingly locked at 60 beats per minute. She didn't pull her boot away from Eleanor's grip, nor did she lean into the emotion. She simply stood there, an unyielding pillar of military authority. Slowly, deliberately, Jacqueline reached up and adjusted the alignment of her service cap, ensuring the embroidered silver Air Force eagle sat perfectly level above her brow. "I don't negotiate with corporate parasites, Eleanor," Jacqueline said, her voice dropping into that quiet, terrifyingly resonant register that cut through Cassandra's distant wailing. "And I certainly don't negotiate with traders who trade the structural integrity of American aircraft for a quarterly profit margin. The Mercer name didn't belong to you, it belonged to my grandfather. And he would have ordered the firing squad himself." She stepped backward, smoothly disengaging her boot from Eleanor's trembling fingers. "The invoice for your arrogance has finally come due, Eleanor. It's fully itemized, and the interest is non-negotiable. Live with it." Jacqueline turned her back on them for the final time. As she walked toward the side exit of the courtroom, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the shadows of the gallery to meet her. It was Daniel. He wore no uniform, just a rugged, dark canvas jacket and heavy work jeans, but his hands bore the distinct, thick calluses of a veteran metropolitan firefighter. He had stood in the back of the room for 3 hours, silent, unblinking, acting as her emotional anchor while she dismantled her past. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply stepped into stride beside her, his massive, warm hand sliding into hers, his fingers locking between her calloused knuckles with an unspoken promise that had been kept through every deployment, every blackout, and every storm. Together, they walked through the secure exit doors, leaving the screams of the dying dynasty behind them in the dark. 3 years later, the National Air and Space Museum, Washington, D.C., the morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass pavilion of the museum, illuminating the sweeping, majestic lines of American aviation history suspended in the air. The space was filled with the low, pleasant murmur of tourists, the laughter of children, and the ambient hum of a capital city at peace. Jacqueline walked slowly beneath the immense, dark belly of a legendary strategic bomber, her steps light and unhurried. She was entirely out of uniform, wearing a tailored emerald green trench coat over soft denim, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. The sharp, hyper-vigilant tension that had defined her posture for 2 decades had softened into something beautiful, relaxed, and deeply grounded. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the tiny, warm hand of a 3-year-old girl named Chloe. Chloe had Cassandra's bright green eyes, but none of her mother's learned malice. After the federal courts had finished liquidating Mercer Holdings, Cassandra had been sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal facility. Her husband, a hedge fund manager who had married into the family solely for the Capital Network, had filed for divorce within 48 hours of the arrest, abandoning the infant Chloe to the state before fleeing to a non-extradition territory in South America. The family had vanished into the dirt of their own greed. But Jacqueline had returned to the wreckage one last time, not for the real estate and not for the money, but to pull the single innocent life out of the ashes. She had legally adopted Chloe within a month of the trial's conclusion, breaking the cycle of emotional starvation before it could touch another generation. "Look, Mama Jackie, look at the big bird," Chloe chirped, pointing her small finger up at the silver wings of an old rescue helicopter suspended from the steel rafters above them. Jacqueline stopped, looking up at the machine. It was a refurbished HH-60G Pave Hawk, the exact model she had flown through the narrow, fiery canyons of the Hindu Kush. The sun caught the plexiglass of the cockpit, rendering it bright, clear, and perfectly still. Daniel stepped up beside them, carrying 2 boxes of apple juice and a camera. He wrapped his free arm around Jacqueline's waist, pulling her close against his chest. He smelled of cedarwood, clean sweat, and home. "She looks just like you when she looks at the sky," Daniel whispered, kissing the top of Jacqueline's head. Jacqueline smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She looked down at Chloe, then back up at the open, sun-drenched pavilion of the museum. There were no black budgets here. There were no invoices, no gold leaf cages, and no cold, calculating stepmothers trying to clip her wings. She had faced the saltwater exile, endured the hell of the training fields, and executed a flawless, surgical reckoning against the people who had tried to erase her. And now, standing beneath the open sky with her husband and the child she had saved, Jacqueline Mercer was finally, completely, and permanently free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.